There's different theories. One is that there was a royal class of giant Native Americans.
What if the biggest lie in history isn't what they told us, but what they erased? Ancient maps speak of Tartaria, a lost global empire, while forbidden records hint at giants who walked among humans as its guardians.
It's not just newspaper accounts. George Washington reported giant bones in Virginia. Even Abraham Lincoln talked about the discovery of giant bones.
Colossal buildings still stand, scaled beyond human limits. Yet their creators are missing from history. Were these giants real? And if they were, why was their existence buried? This is the mystery of the giants they erased from history. Tartaria, the name that vanished from the map. There was a time when Tartaria was impossible to ignore. For hundreds of years, the name appeared prominently across European maps, academic texts, and official encyclopedias. From the 13th century until the early 19th century, Tartaria described an immense region spanning northern and central Asia, stretching from Eastern Europe toward the Pacific Ocean. These documents were not speculative sketches, but formal records produced by leading cartographers in an era when mapping the world was a serious scientific pursuit. At the time, Europe possessed limited first-hand knowledge of Asia's interior. Long-distance travel was rare, political boundaries were poorly defined, and much information came from traders and missionaries rather than direct observation. To manage this uncertainty, mapmakers relied on broad regional names. Tartaria became a collective label for vast lands inhabited by diverse groups, including Turkic, Mongolic, and Siberian peoples often grouped under the name Tatars. It was a term born from limited knowledge, not a description of a single empire. As exploration intensified, the world map began to change. The Russian Empire conducted detailed surveys as it expanded eastward, while Chinese and Central Asian territories were increasingly documented with precision. With clearer borders and improved geographic understanding, older labels lost their purpose. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria no longer appeared on modern maps, replaced by the political names and boundaries still used today. Yet the disappearance of the name raises an important question. When a term used for centuries suddenly vanishes, what else fades with it? Old maps bearing the name Tartaria still exist in archives and libraries, offering a glimpse into how the world was once understood. But they also hint at overlooked details recorded alongside the geography. Within the same historical sources that reference Tartaria are brief mentions of extraordinary human stature, oversized artifacts, and architecture that seems scaled beyond normal proportions. These observations were noted without explanation and later ignored as geographic knowledge evolved. As the name Tartaria slipped out of common use, so did many of these curious details. They remain preserved only in fragments, waiting to be examined more closely. Giants in historical records. As Tartaria faded from the map, another pattern quietly followed it into obscurity. Across ancient and early modern history, references to unusually tall humans appear in written records from multiple cultures. These accounts are not limited to folklore or legend. They exist in historical writings, religious texts, and early scientific observations, often described plainly rather than as fantasy. Roman historians, medieval chroniclers, and early scholars occasionally documented extraordinary human stature as an abnormal but real occurrence. Religious texts provide some of the earliest examples. Biblical passages mention groups described Nephilim and the Rephaim as giants, including the presented as physical beings encountered by ordinary people. In the Greco-Roman world, writers such as Pliny the Elder recorded reports of individuals who exceeded normal human height, treating them as natural curiosities rather than supernatural creatures. These records reflect how ancient societies documented unusual physical traits long before modern biology existed. By the 18th and 19th centuries, reports of giant human skeletons began appearing in newspapers, local archives, and early archaeological notes, particularly in Europe and North America. Many were discovered during construction projects, farming, or mining operations. At the time, archaeology was still developing as a discipline. Measurements were often inconsistent, preservation methods were poor, and documentation standards varied widely. As a result, many discoveries were either lost, damaged, or recorded without sufficient detail for later verification. Modern science provides explanations for some of these cases. Medical conditions such as gigantism and acromegaly can cause extreme height due to hormonal disorders. In other instances, skeletal distortion, erosion, or misidentification played a role. Large animal bones were sometimes mistaken for human remains, leading to exaggerated claims in early reports. As scientific standards improved, many of these findings were reclassified or dismissed. Yet not every detail fits neatly into these explanations. Oversized armor, massive stone tools, and architectural features, such as unusually tall doorways and staircases, continue to appear across different regions. Mainstream historians often attribute these elements to symbolism, ceremonial design, or aesthetic preference. However, their repeated presence raises questions about whether ancient societies were accommodating individuals of greater than average stature, more frequently than assumed. What makes these records especially notable is their historical overlap. Many references to unusually tall humans appear during the same centuries, when Tartaria was still recognized on global maps. As geographic knowledge advanced and historical narratives became more standardized, both the name Tartaria and these anomalous accounts faded from mainstream attention. What remains is not definitive proof of a lost race of giants, but a collection of historical observations that resist easy dismissal. And taken together, they suggest that the human past may be more complex than the simplified version preserved in modern textbooks. Architecture built beyond human scale. If unusually tall humans appear in historical records, the environments they lived in raise even more questions. Across Europe, Asia, and parts of the Americas, ancient and early modern architecture reveals a recurring pattern. Structures built on a scale that often feels excessive for average human use. Massive stone doorways, towering windows, oversized staircases, and halls with ceilings far higher than structurally necessary appear in buildings officially attributed to ordinary populations using pre-industrial tools. These features are not isolated. They repeat across regions separated by vast distances. Historians explain much of this through symbolism and function. Large doorways conveyed power. High ceilings improved airflow. Monumental design projected authority, especially in palaces, temples, and government buildings. These explanations are valid and supported by architectural theory. Yet they do not fully account for why such features appear even in structures labeled as administrative, residential, or utilitarian, rather than ceremonial. In parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, older stone foundations lie beneath later constructions, often mismatched in scale. Lower levels feature massive blocks, unusually tall entrances, and windows positioned far above ground level, while upper levels reflect later, more familiar human proportions. Archaeologists generally attribute this to rebuilding, subsidence, or changing architectural styles over time. Still, the consistent pattern of oversized lower levels continues to draw attention. Similar questions arise when examining ancient stonework. Many structures use blocks weighing tens or even hundreds of tons, fitted with remarkable precision. Mainstream archaeology explains this through human ingenuity, simple machines, and large labor forces. No evidence requires non-human builders. However, the sheer scale of these constructions reinforces the impression that ancient societies were comfortable working far beyond modern expectations of pre-industrial capability. What makes this particularly intriguing is how architecture intersects with earlier chapters of history. Many of these oversized structures appear in regions once labeled as part of Tartaria on early maps. As the name Tartaria disappeared, so did unified narratives explaining the origins of these buildings. They were reassigned to local histories, often without clear documentation of who built the earliest layers or for whom. No credible evidence proves these structures were designed for giants, but their proportions, combined with historical references to unusually tall humans, suggest that past societies may have included greater physical diversity than is commonly acknowledged. At the very least, they challenge the assumption that ancient builders always designed strictly for bodies identical to our own. These buildings still stand today, silent and unquestioning. They do not tell us who their builders were, only that they existed, worked at immense scale, and left behind structures that continue to defy easy explanation. When evidence quietly disappears, history is not only shaped by what is discovered, but by what is preserved. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeology, anthropology, and history were still forming as modern sciences. Standards for excavation, documentation, and preservation were inconsistent. Many early discoveries were recorded briefly in newspapers, local journals, or private letters, then lost to time. When institutions later professionalized these fields, Only a fraction of earlier findings were formally archived. This transition matters. Numerous reports from the 1700s and 1800 describe unusually large skeletons, oversized tools, and ancient structures uncovered during construction or land development. Some were displayed temporarily in local museums or exhibitions. Others were studied briefly before being reclassified or discarded due to lack of context. In many cases, the physical evidence no longer exists, leaving behind only written references. Skeptics argue that this is exactly what should be expected. Early measurements were often inaccurate. Sensationalism sold newspapers. Misidentified animal bones and exaggerated estimates were common. As scientific rigor increased, unsupported claims were filtered out. From this perspective, nothing was erased, only corrected. Yet corrections do not always come with clear explanations. In museum records, items sometimes vanish without detailed notes. Old catalog entries list artifacts that are no longer present, with no indication of when or why they were removed. In academic revisions, earlier reports are dismissed in footnotes or ignored entirely, rather than examined in detail. Over time, repetition of dismissal becomes indistinguishable from disappearance. The same pattern appears in historical narratives. Broad regional terms like Tartaria were replaced with precise political labels, simplifying complex histories. Along with that simplification came a narrowing of acceptable interpretations. Anomalies that did not fit emerging frameworks were sidelined, not necessarily out of malice, but out of necessity. Science advances by reducing uncertainty, and ambiguity is often treated as error. But ambiguity is also where unanswered questions live. When multiple anomalies cluster around the same periods and regions, unusual architecture, historical references to extraordinary stature, and the quiet loss of physical evidence, they invite closer scrutiny, not to confirm extraordinary claims, but to understand how easily inconvenient details can be overlooked when they complicate a cleaner narrative. Nothing here proves intentional suppression, but it does demonstrate how history can change shape over time, not through dramatic erasure, but through omission, reinterpretation, and neglect. And once evidence slips beyond the reach of verification, all that remains are fragments, waiting for someone to ask why they were forgotten in the first place. The rise of the Guardians of Tartaria. When records become fragmented, stories begin to take shape. As Tartaria faded from maps, and anomalous historical details slipped from mainstream discussion, later generations were left with pieces rather than a complete picture. Old maps showed a vast territory once unified under a single name. Early writings mentioned unusually tall humans. Architecture hinted at proportions beyond the ordinary. None of these elements alone suggested anything extraordinary. Together, they invited interpretation. It is within this space that the idea of giants as guardians of Tartaria emerged. Not from a single ancient source, but from the gradual linking of scattered observations. In many cultures, individuals of exceptional size were historically associated with authority, protection, or leadership. Height symbolized power, strength implied responsibility. Over time, unusually tall humans recorded in historical accounts were no longer seen as anomalies, but as figures of importance within their societies. Folklore played a role in shaping this narrative. Across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Siberia, oral traditions speak of powerful ancestral figures who defended lands, guided communities, or lived alongside ordinary humans. These figures were not always described as monstrous giants, but as larger, stronger ancestors whose presence marked an earlier age. As written records thinned, oral memory filled the gaps. Architecture reinforced this perception. Massive halls, towering doorways, and monumental stonework suggested spaces meant for authority rather than comfort. In later interpretations, these environments became associated with guardianship and command. The builders, whoever they were, appeared to operate at a scale that inspired reverence. Over time, scale itself became evidence. Modern interpretations often project intention backward. Where historians see symbolism or practicality, alternative narratives see design for taller beings. Where scholars see coincidence, others see coordination. The Guardians of Tartaria are born not from proof, but from pattern recognition applied to incomplete information. This does not mean the idea is false, nor does it mean it is true. It means it is human. When history loses continuity, imagination restores meaning. And when official explanations feel insufficient, people search for narratives that connect the fragments into something coherent. Shadows of a forgotten civilization. Even centuries later, Tartaria remains a question mark in the story of human history. Unlike other empires, it leaves behind no continuous written records or clear political legacy. What survives are scattered pieces, old maps labeling vast territories, mysterious architectural remains, and occasional reports of unusually tall humans. Each fragment raises more questions than answers, creating a puzzle that refuses to be solved. The architecture alone is remarkable. In Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe, massive stone foundations, enormous doorways, and monumental halls still stand. These structures are often built with extraordinary precision, and at scales far beyond what most pre-industrial communities would need. Scholars explain this as advanced engineering and organized labor, but the repetition of oversized designs across distant regions remains unusual. The buildings suggest a society capable of large-scale coordination, yet its identity and full history are obscured. Historical records add another layer of intrigue. References to humans of extraordinary height appear across different eras and regions. While some can be explained through medical conditions like gigantism or exaggeration in storytelling, the consistency of these reports, especially in areas once associated with Tartaria, cannot be easily dismissed. They hint at a world where human diversity, and perhaps human potential, was greater than we assume. The disappearance of the name Tartaria deepens the mystery. Once prominent on maps and in academic texts, the term faded rapidly by the mid-1800s. Historians cite improved geographic knowledge and evolving political boundaries, but the sudden vanishing of a name used for centuries leaves a gap. Without it, the architecture and odd historical records drift in isolation, disconnected from context, almost as if deliberately removed from common memory. What emerges is a world half seen, half remembered. Tartaria may not have been a single unified empire, but its traces suggest a civilization of extraordinary scale and capability. A civilization whose story is now largely lost. The more we examine these remnants, giant structures, anomalous human references, and erased maps, the more it becomes clear that history has left deliberate blanks. And in those blanks, the mind naturally searches for answers, for guardians, for figures who once walked among us, silent witnesses to a forgotten chapter of humanity. Evidence people point to what it really shows. The legend of Tartaria and the idea of giants often begin with maps. Centuries-old European maps consistently label a vast region as Tartary or Tartaria, stretching across northern and central Asia. To modern eyes, these maps seem mysterious, as if they hint at a lost civilization erased from history. But the truth is more mundane, yet fascinating in its own way. At the time these maps were drawn, European explorers had limited knowledge of Asia's interior. Cartographers relied on second-hand reports and broad geographic labels to fill in the unknown. Tartary was never a single empire. It was a placeholder for lands that had not yet been fully explored. As explorers returned with accurate information and political borders became clearer, the term disappeared, replaced by the countries we recognize today. The maps did not erase history. They reflect the evolution of human knowledge. Architecture is another source often cited by enthusiasts. Massive stone foundations, towering doorways, enormous halls, and precise masonry appear in multiple regions, from Central Asia to Eastern Europe. Their scale can seem impossible, almost as if they were designed for larger humans. Scholars, however, offer grounded explanations. Large structures were often symbolic, representing power, authority, or religious significance. High ceilings, wide staircases, and monumental gates served practical functions like ventilation, movement, and ceremony. Pre-industrial societies were capable of remarkable feats using coordinated labor, simple machines, and skilled planning. While the size of these constructions inspires awe, it reflects human ingenuity rather than evidence of a race of giants. Stories of giant skeletons also appear in historical records, particularly in 18th and 19th century newspapers and local archives. Skeletons said to exceed ordinary human height were occasionally reported during farming, construction, or mining. Modern researchers have shown that many of these claims are inaccurate. Measurement errors were common, bones were sometimes misidentified, and sensationalism often exaggerated the truth. Some discoveries may have involved rare medical conditions like gigantism, but no verified skeletons exist beyond the natural limits of human variation. The reports, fascinating as they are, tell us more about the curiosity and imagination of the time than about hidden giants. Finally, there is the issue of missing or lost evidence. It is true that some artifacts, records, and early reports have been damaged, misplaced, or poorly documented. Wars, fires, natural decay, and the limited archival methods of the past all contributed to gaps in the historical record. While the absence of certain records can feel mysterious, historians see this as a natural result of preservation challenges rather than intentional erasure. Taken together, these pieces of evidence tell a compelling story, but one grounded in reality. Old maps, large architecture, unusual skeleton reports, and missing records all exist. They are real. Yet none of them prove that a hidden empire or a race of giants ever existed. What they do show is that our understanding of history is incomplete and evolving. Gaps, anomalies, and unanswered questions spark curiosity and imagination, giving rise to legends like Tartaria and its supposed guardians. The true mystery is not whether the claims are literally true, but why these fragments continue to captivate our minds and invite us to look closer at the past. Even after centuries of maps, records, and scholarly research, the story of Tartaria refuses to fade. The question is not whether it existed as an empire or whether giants truly walked among humans, but why these ideas continue to capture the imagination of so many. Human beings are naturally drawn to mysteries. When gaps appear in records, when maps vanish or architectural feats seem inexplicable, the mind searches for explanations that feel complete. Legends emerge to fill those gaps. In the case of Tartaria, missing maps, lost documents, enormous buildings, and reports of unusually tall humans created fertile ground for stories of a forgotten civilization protected by towering guardians. The fragments of real history were transformed, over generations, into something larger than themselves. Popular culture plays a powerful role in keeping these myths alive. Books, documentaries, and online videos amplify the mystery, often emphasizing the unexplained while leaving out the scientific context. The result is a feedback loop. Curiosity fuels speculation, speculation fuels further attention, and attention ensures that the story continues to grow. Architecture designed for symbolism, maps drawn out of incomplete knowledge, and rare cases of gigantism become, in this narrative, evidence of a hidden, extraordinary past. At the same time, the myths resonate because they offer a sense of wonder and possibility. They suggest that our world is deeper, older, and stranger than textbooks admit. They invite viewers and readers to question what is recorded, what is forgotten, and what may have been deliberately left out. In a world increasingly dominated by facts and data, stories like Tartaria's giants remind us that mystery is still compelling, and that the unknown has power. Even as historians and scientists explain the real reasons behind maps, monuments, and skeletal reports, the legend persists, not because it is proven, but because it taps into something essential about human curiosity. The need to imagine worlds beyond the familiar, to explore what might have been, and to wonder at the unseen. In the end, Tartaria and its giants endure less as verified history and more as a symbol, a reminder that the past still holds shadows, and that the questions we ask about those shadows are sometimes more important than the answers. Thanks for watching.